very briefly introducing the rest of the panel. Polly Toynbee, I think, can see John and raise him 5 for the politicians and other figures that she's interviewed and commented on over the years, most notably for The Guardian, and Stefan Stern, who writes for the FT and is a visiting professor at Cass Business School. I think was perhaps the first journalist who picked up the work that David Owen was doing on Hubris and commented on it about the applicability to the corporate world. Maybe if I kick off by asking the question, how do the media magnify charisma when it's a good thing and deflate hubris when it needs to be? Polly?
I think they do it very badly, and as John said, we are players ourselves with our own interests in making things exciting and interesting and exaggerating things. But it worries me a lot. I'd like to take up something John said about the end, about puncturing them, as if it were our duty to constantly joust with politicians and assume that they are all knaves in one way or another.
No, not them. They're hubris.
They're
hubris. Which is a different matter.
You mean only the hubris?
Well, no, bring them back to have a conversation with us as normal human beings.
But they're not normal human beings. I mean, I think we have elected them. That gives them a status above the rest of us, an earned status. And I think we should be a bit careful about assuming that all politicians, that it is despicable to aspire to be a politician, to aspire to be elected. It's quite dangerous. There's something very odd about democracy, that we have an almost exaggerated reverence for democracy itself, a kind of worshipping of it. We're willing to go around the world at the point of a gun, spreading it wherever we can, because it's so good for people, and yet at the same time holding those who practice it in such contempt. And this has been so since, the ancient Greeks and Romans. There were graffiti abusive about politicians right back from the beginning of democracy. This odd conflict we have about worshipping the ism of democracy, but not those who do it. So I think we should be very careful about the idea that it's always our job to puncture, to destroy, to undermine, to look for the weakness. I mean, true, we don't just sit there and let them reel out the latest boring press release. And, you are very good at this, because I think, John, actually, you do have quite a fundamental respect for journalists, for politicians in a way that some journalists don't, and simply see it as an aggressive game. But there's an element you haven't brought in there. This is the degree to which they've come on not to communicate, but to deliver a package. They don't care what your question is, and the viewer is actually completely exasperated. There are some questions in the air which happen not to suit them to answer. They've come in to talk about something else. And that our job surely is, I really do agree with you 100%, not to destroy them, but definitely to puncture the hubris and break through the packaging which is preventing us ordinary electors from having a reasonable conversation with them. But sometimes the packaging, what you call the packaging, is actually wanting to get a message out there. How the hell do you say, here's our really important policy on this we want to talk about today? Nobody will hear about it because they won't hear about it in the newspapers. They'll only hear about the noise around it. What does it mean? What are they up to? What does it signify? How do you actually get stuff out there? It is very difficult. Occasionally they can write articles, mostly very boring ones that few people read. Mostly everything that they do and say is mediated by people who often offer a bias against understanding, as opposed to, well, let's try and see what it is you really believe in and what you really think. So I think it's, the good interviewers can do that too and actually get to the bottom of what it is they think. But quite often, the assumption is we don't actually know what you want to know what you want to tell us. Policy's boring.
I'm going to be a bit pedantic and try and keep the debate as much as possible to hubris, and I'm not sure that the increasing on-message tendency is necessarily a byproduct of hubris. I was going to ask Stefan Stern, picking up on the point that John made about the easy ride that over the years perhaps Richard Branson has had from the media. Do you think there tends to be dual standards between the way the media go quite ferociously for politicians and other people in public life broadly, but actually give perhaps businessmen and women quite an easy ride?
I think there are certainly dual standards. In fact, there are several standards. And what I worry about most of all is the way in which leadership, not in The Guardian or on Channel 4 News or the FT, but the way that we have a very generalised and crude and oversimplified discussion about leadership. The context in which leaders are operating is absolutely crucial. And so leaders are going to be different in different circumstances. And you mentioned football. You'll have noticed, those of you who do watch football, that the cameras seem to stay for a remarkable amount of time on the dugout, on the manager. Now, the manager is not actually playing. In Bob Reid's terminology, he's not even really a supervisory manager because he's not doing the work. The work is on the pitch, and yet we hold up the manager as this sort of heroic figure. And that's also part of the puffing up of leaders. And this does go back. We've had all the right examples, because Mrs. Thatcher, of course. It's worth remembering it was it was 1980, 34 years ago, that in Brighton she said, for those of you waiting for that popular media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say, U-turn if you want to, the lady's not for turning. Now, that was 34 years ago, and yet that remains the dominant image that we have of what we think, what the general public often think good leadership looks like. We think U-turn, changing your mind is terrible. In America, they call it flip-flopping, and that's somehow not allowed. And this is a very crude version of leadership. So I think that's an area where also I've wrestled with this in my work. We want to have a more interesting and more thoughtful and more incisive discussion about leadership.
Can I ask you something about business leaders?
Yeah.
One of the problems with business leaders is that they are so hubristic, they are so surrounded by courtiers, they are never challenged, I mean, unless they're suddenly thrown out, but until then, that they won't appear in public. Newsnight tries very hard to get leading players, your Unilever guy, whoever, they will never do it. Martin Sorrell over and over and over again, because he's the only guy who will, and he's rather a bad representative, I think, of the business world on the whole, earning his £30 million a year. There are lots of reasons why he might be not the absolute best spokesman. But their refusal, they don't feel any social obligation to have to explain themselves, appear in public, represent the business world or what they're doing. All of our livelihoods in the end depend on them, but they don't feel they have to be public figures.
Well, I think that's right, and the PR advice they're getting is there's nothing to gain from going on. Now, I have interviewed Paul Polman, and what you say is true. I mean, an amazingly forceful and driven person with terrific focus, but I think you're right. I'm not sure of any broadcast interviews he's done, and yet he's very confident of his material. He knows exactly what he's about. Yes, no, they just think it's a no-win. So there might be a media problem in that too, but their feeling is that they don't somehow owe something. They've got investor relations people and expensive PR firms to handle that for them, and they can take all the heat off. But they're not used to being challenged. That's certainly true.
I think there's a really good example of an institution which has changed dramatically because of the leadership. And that, as you saw this morning, is the Bank of England. The Bank of England, I mean, Mark Carney is charismatic, genuinely charismatic, and a really charming and interesting, thoughtful, engaging man who's prepared to answer the questions you ask him. And that's so rare. Yeah. It's a shock. It's a terrible shock. There's a man in public life absolutely at the top of the tree, topper really than the Prime Minister, because, boy, he's got the levers of financial activity and the rest of it in his hand, and he's real. Yes. And answers the questions.
But does he want to be Prime Minister of Canada one day?
Oh, he does. Well, so we're told. But I think he's hooked on this one.
I think the part of the question is, to what extent does power drive people mad? I mean, you said, I think rightly, that Blair was probably not mad in the beginning. I realise this is a forbidden word. I take it back.
I think you're safe for discussing Erdogan. And he's a really interesting subject, because he is a guy who started off good and is now mad.
But I mean, I think David Owen's bill suggesting that people shouldn't, that nobody should be leader for longer than 8 years, possibly 10. I think really 8 years. I think 8 years is the point. Hugo Young always used to say this too. That is suddenly the turning point when the sheer day-to-day busyness and constantly dealing with every almost 20 minutes of your day, another really important matter, another really important person, in the end gets to you and you lose your bearings. And I don't think you can keep any sense of proportion as to who you are in the real world or continue to be anything resembling an ordinary person when you've been subjected to that. And you either become intensely paranoid or very hubristic, or you prefer spending all your time abroad because it seems to be nicer there than the messy problems at home, or you go to war.
Yeah. You mentioned Jesus, John. I think it was Matthew Paris who pointed out in Blair's final speech as leader in Manchester in 2006 that he ended with this oration which said something like, "Behold, I am always with you." I mean, it's pretty... He may not have said "behold," but he did say, I am always with you.
But funny enough, we were talking about this earlier, and I think that the moment of greatest hubris in Blair's premiership was the standing ovation that he was given by both houses of Congress in America after the Iraq War had started. It was an amazing sort of sight, and you could see that it was something which had now lifted him off the earth. And then, of course, he got on the plane, flew to Japan to a G20 or G7 or something, and what did he land to hear? That David Kelly had murdered himself, or somebody murdered him.
And also the Kosovan children shouting his name.
Yes.
That must get to you.
It must. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Coming back to the role of the media, isn't it? I mean, we, the public, want our heroes. We love our heroes. Shareholders love the idea of the charismatic leader. And the challenge, in a sense, isn't it, is for the media to respond to that, but not maybe be...
I think we have a good example of that in the media's treatment of Ed Miliband, who is not charismatic, but thoroughly decent, very serious. Of all the people around him, when they keep saying, who else can we have, who else can we have, he's the cleverest, he's the most serious and really most experienced. And yet he is absolutely rubbish for not fitting the template of leader that we all crave. And people do. They want every single ingredient. They want the presentational skills of Blair. They want the depth of Attlee. They want somebody who's tremendously collegiate and yet stands alone. They want an impossible, an increasingly impossible set of virtues that you could never expect to find in any one person. And as a result, they get demolished for not having whichever brand of them they haven't got.
Well, the intervention has been the advent of television. I mean, it's hard to imagine how Clem Attlee would have managed on television, and yet he was the best Prime Minister, probably one of the best Prime Ministers ever lived. But he would have been undone by television because he couldn't express himself in those sort of terms. He was a wonderful team leader. He galvanised people into activity. A very good sort of judge of how a meeting was going and the rest of it. It's a tragedy. We are a menace.
But I think the business world is changing. I'm not sure that shareholders do particularly want charismatic leaders or superstar leaders. I think they want results, sustained results, which may have nothing to do with charisma. If I can just, a very quick quote from a management guru. It's my job to introduce you to management gurus, ladies and gentlemen. This one's called Jim Collins, and he wrote a book called Built to Last 20 years ago, and another one called Good to Great, and so on. But I interviewed him a few years ago, and he said, charisma... he says, if I'm enormously charismatic, I can convince you to do a lot of things because of the force of my personality. But force of personality is not an argument. It's not facts. It's not evidence. It's not data. He said, charisma is irrelevant. It's not good or bad. It's irrelevant. And I think that actually is where a lot more people are in business today. It's about numbers and results, not necessarily showmen or showwomen.
which it was in politics. In politics, it tends to be traditionally that those on the centre-left are endlessly producing the statistics, the facts, how things are really happening, how wealth is really shared or not, the trajectory we're on towards greater inequality and so on. And on the right, they do one juicy anecdote and it knocks all the numbers sideways. So politics is a different business,
Very different.
Really. It is about the art of persuasion. And it might be persuasion for good or it might be persuasion for ill. But that's what the profession is. I mean, I think politics is a noble occupation, but it does involve a whole lot of talents, one of which is ability to sway people.
Time for the floor. Gentlemen.
I've never had a chance to ask people this before. I think rolling 24-hour news is a disaster, and I think it builds in this hubris because, in essence, someone gets jumped on something that happened half an hour ago, they have to answer, they can't flip-flop, and therefore they take a position and feel compelled to hold it. I think we had far better analysis and maybe better governance when people actually had time to go away, think, take a team meeting before they answered the the question. And I'm just interested to know what your opinions is.
Well, I sort of agree with you. I mean, I don't think it's been... I mean, in fact, very, very few people watch it. That's quite... But the trouble is the people who watch it are the people who are on it. I mean, that's a truism. I mean, there are times when Sky is down to sort of, 20,000 and at least 1,000 of them are sitting in Westminster. I mean, so... but you see... there's, of course, a way of dealing with this. You just say, you wouldn't expect me to have an answer for you right now. I'm going to meet with my team. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to look into it. I'm going to consider what's going on. And when I have, I'll tell you. I'll be out. But instead, there's sort of, no. And so all you hear is, what are you going to do about it, Prime Minister? Well, you don't need to do it like that. It could all be... But because they never want to be caught short in terms of having the answer right now, they play the game too. It isn't a one-way street. It's a two-way street. Admittedly, 24-hour television has encouraged that two-way street, but really they could deal with it pretty easily. They could say, I'm very sorry, you would not be able to answer this yourself, let alone me, and I'm now sorting out what's going on, and when I know, I'll get back to you. Well, why don't you know now? Well, for perfectly obvious reasons. I've got a lot of things on my plate, and this is not one of them.
Can I just quickly... Yes, you may have seen last Saturday's FT, Gillian Tett wrote a piece about can boring, proportionate, moderate politicians get any coverage anymore because they've got to say something hyperbolical and now. But another very good chief executive, Jeff Immelt of GE, was climbing down a mountain in Africa, I forget which one, with his daughter. And in Swahili, the guide said to him, puli, puli, which apparently means slowly, slowly. And what Immelt says is if you're serious about leading complicated organisations, you've actually got to go slowly, but with persistence. Again, it's counter the modern instant trend.
It was a great piece, that. It posed the question of whether Jeb Bush could be elected, because he's going to be dull.
He's moderate.
Yeah,
relatively.
Relatively.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, by
my accent and my name, which happens to be Scotland, may give you a clue as to where I'm going with this. And it is about the relationship between the press and politicians and about hubris. It does seem to me, and there's a question coming after it, it does seem to me that there is a significant change in the relationship between politicians and the press and the media. And we saw the early signs of it in September. And I'd be interested in your views on what seemed to be a very different relationship that was developing between the Scottish National Party and the news media.
Well, I'd like to answer that because I was in Scotland a lot in the build-up to the vote. And it was one of the most exciting and uplifting political events I've ever experienced in any country, anywhere on earth. And the quality of the debate was unbelievably high. Whether it was no or yes, both sides were articulate, formed, they understood why they were where they were. And you could be in really run-down, desperate places and find people having a really intelligent, interesting discussion about what was going on. I think an event happened which unleashed the ordinary politics of the ordinary people. I'm not saying this was either a yes or a no faction. The fact is there was a high quality of debate by both sides. And I don't think anything new happened except that the quality and capacity of the Scottish people to have an intelligent debate about a serious issue was revealed. And I'm afraid to say I felt very impoverished. I felt, could we have had such a debate south of the border?
John, I don't think it was about the border. I think it was about the nature of an abstract question that doesn't have a person attached to it. There was, in a sense, all right, you could say Salmon's character and maybe Alistair Darley's character were part of it, but they weren't the central to the story. It was not who's going to be Prime Minister. It was not who's going to lead. It was about an idea in which everybody felt safe to come out and vote without having to say, I'm giving my support to X. And that's what increasingly people hate doing. And a lot of the people who won't vote, it's because I'm damned if I'm going to give anybody my precious vote. It's not apathy. And it's a dislike of the idea of having to openly support somebody. And I wonder how long that'll last in Scotland when the question again becomes who, as opposed to what.
Do you think that's because people feel there is a deficiency of charisma or an excess of hubris?
Well, it might be both,
Could I come
as
in on
John
that
had
answer? 'Cause
originally said.
I would say the hubris we saw was in the Westminster politicians who dared at the 25th hour to get together and conspire to put together a completely fraudulent offer, bomb up there, join together the three of them. It was a revolting sight to see three people who hated each other more than anybody in this room hates each other, and stand together and tell the Scottish people, don't worry, trust us, we'll fix it. It was all nonsense, and they got what they deserved.
But I saw one hubristic moment that you might be thinking of, and it happened to a former colleague of yours, Faisal Islam, when he tried to ask Alex Salmond about what currency Scotland would have and what sterlingisation might mean, and Salmond not only refused to answer the question, but he told him that he had effectively joined the No campaign by daring to ask these questions. And that was hubristic too.
Lady,
Sorry, I'm not sure that you've discriminated between charisma, I would call it extroversion, being open and out there and sort of, great media, and hubris. And I wonder if you did, whether the media would start to be interested in interviewing people without hubris who also made good telly.
Well,
and that's what needs to be promoted.
That's a very interesting question. I don't actually come across a great deal of charisma, to be absolutely honest. I don't think it's a boundless thing. I mean, let's be candid. I mean, they were very great people. Gorbachev, charisma. Mandela, charisma. No hubris in either of them. I mean, the very fact they didn't have hubris, well, in Mandela's case, probably saved the day. And probably in Gorbachev's case, saved the day. Hubris abounds, but I think charisma is a rare thing, and you generally seem to find it in the arts. But I don't think we can list a top 10 charismatic figures straight off the top of our heads, can we?
No, there are a lot of sham show-offs, which is something quite different. There's plenty of that. But people with that authentic interior sense of self that they're able to express in a way that is sympathetic and understanding and makes one warm to them, not just.
I wondered
to
whether our esteemed
glibness.
leader had made a journey from hubris to charisma.
I think he's always had a bit of charisma myself.
Well, he's always had, but I think he used to have a little bit of hubris at the beginning. What would you say, David?
As chair of the gentleman with the mic.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for acknowledging the role the media does play in this. I think you've done a very honest job on that. In doing so, you've slightly sidestepped something rather different, which is the media's own hubris in itself. So enabling others is one thing, but what about the media's own proneness to hubris, and how does that show up, and what can you do about it? Because you've spoken as if these things are out there and you can't do anything about them. And I think a lot of people would say you're pretty powerful people.
Well, a plea for understanding in charity, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, this is an industry, this is a trade, not a profession, an industry that's in a terrible state of flux. I mean, good and bad. But print newspapers, most circulations falling. And the battle for audience share in this multi-channel digital world also really, really tough. So this is, what shall I say, an explanation but not an excuse for some of the bad behaviour. But of course there is a tendency to shout louder, to try and be heard, and to be a little bit more, not with among colleagues here, but in other parts of the media, a tendency to be profoundly relaxed about accuracy, I'm afraid to say, and hyperbole. I might lose my NUJ card for saying that in a public meeting, but I mean, I'm afraid I think it's true. And we do ourselves down when we are sort of blatantly, manifestly, willfully misleading, inaccurate, or when we have this other thing about moving the story on. This is what journalists say. We are going to move the story on, or we have decided that the public is now bored with this. We don't really know, but we just say it, and we decide, and we select the story. So there's a hell of a lot of judgment behind the running list and the display in a newspaper.
Well, I think you've touched on something which is really, really important. I mean, I absolutely agree with the tenet of your question. There is something happening which Stefan has kind of alluded to, but there's more to it. There is the online life. There is Twitter, there is Facebook, there is the social network generally. And hubris is pouring out across these networks. I mean, we've lost the war in terms of conventional broadcasting and print publication and the rest of it. Now we're desperately scrabbling to reinterest people, and by doing so, we are deploying hubris. I mean, I found a wonderful piece in Rolling Stone today about a woman whistleblower who worked in one of the big banks in New York and has really spilt the beans in a big, big way. So I wrote, absolute must read, a truly honourable and tremendous piece in Rolling Stone, etc. I'd never say such a thing on air, but suddenly you're trying to pump it because you're trying to reassert yourselves out there. You know, I mean, and this is a bit dangerous, frankly. There's a lot of it.
I mean, I think it's... we need to remember that we have had, for a very long time, and long before social media, one of the nastiest press environments in the world, without any doubt. I mean, Rupert Murdoch owns over 40% of the readership, and ever since he came in, he made it worse. Wasn't that great in the days of Beaverbrook and Northcliffe either, when the founder of the Daily Mail, Lord Northcliffe, on his deathbed was asked, what was your recipe for creating this incredibly successful newspaper? He said, I give them a daily hate. And it continues. And it's a very successful formula. Almost every day there is something to have you seething, if you believe what they say, on the front page. And to stir up deep and often misplaced passions is the nature of most of the British press. You're very lucky. You've got The Guardian, the FT, and the Channel 4. They are the less popular press on the whole. And I think that most broadcasting, the BBC, gets swept along by the agenda that's set by those newspapers time and again. They try not to. They try very hard. Having been in the BBC newsroom, they try very hard to tread that narrow white line of not being biased. But inevitably, a huge amount of noise on one side will push them that way. They will feel a sense of reassurance next day if they see that their own running order on the 10 o'clock news is roughly the same as most of the newspapers' front pages. They're quite afraid to row their own boat and set their own agenda. And, it is a very nasty world out there. So we set people up and we put them down. You can almost bet whether they're a completely harmless young star of some kind, they will be built up, and you know that in no time at all they will be absolutely cracked down because you'll have done all the building up and that's got boring. Now let's find something really bad about them. And that's true of people all the way through. And of course with politicians right from the beginning, they are set up to fail from day one. The very moment that you are elected, or even aspire to be elected to the House of Commons, you are absolutely fair game. You put yourself up there, we can do whatever we like to you. And it's very brutal. So if they are defensive and packaged and only speak in mantras, it's not surprising. Very few can talk like, as it were, Ken Clarke or Michael Heseltine. There are very few with the talent and the thickness of skin and the bigness to speak as they feel, or more or less, give or take, and sound like human beings. It's a great knack. They live in fear. And so if they develop too little charisma and perhaps rather too much hubris, perhaps it's not surprising.
Gentlemen.
You've correctly mentioned two groups of leaders, politicians, business people. But there are other leaders in the world. There are people in the armed forces who work colossally under stress. There are religious leaders around the world. You, John and Polly, must have interviewed such people. And yet, neither of you have mentioned examples of their hubris, or is it that they avoid it? And if they avoid it, how do they manage that?
Well, it's easy being a religious leader. You just dress it up as someone else, don't you? I mean, it's you, but we've said it's him. It's actually me, you know, but it is him, you know. But no, seriously. Yes, I speak son of a bishop. But seriously, I mean, first of all, I would say, I don't know whether anybody else would agree with this, but I've been absolutely amazed by the quality of officer in the armed forces. It seems to be one area of public life where there's been no diminution of capacity and ability, and they've been asked to do utterly awful things, I mean, to fight in two completely worthless wars. No, I mean, without revolution or rebellion. I mean, you might wish that they had, but in truth, intersecting with them is a very interesting and rewarding experience, and they're wise beyond what you would expect. As for the religious, well, we're going through a really interesting phase. They've put a corporate executive in charge of the Church of England. And he's rather attractive because we can sort of see him as sort of slightly within our own society. I mean, I've got high hopes. And as for the other fellow, I mean, the chap in Rome, I mean, he's clearly kicking over the traces and the rest of it. And everybody said, I was on duty. I was actually in the Vatican, I mean, on the roof, broadcasting when his appointment came up. And unfortunately, the poor old cardinal came up and said Habemus Papam had Parkinson's and was not easy to understand. And all I could hear, as he said live on Channel 4 News, Habemus Papam sui nomine es Jorge Mario. And I had a list of 3 piles of I said, possibles, impossibles, and maybes. And on the top of the impossibles, right in front of me on the floor, was a Jorge Mario. And I thought, there can't be 2 Jorge Marios. So I said, he is the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And so he turned out to be. And he's, and everyone said, he'll be very conservative and all this, but of course he turned out to be a Jesuit. Nobody knew what a Jesuit was unless they were a Catholic. And if they were a Catholic, they knew it was a time bomb. And that's what he's proved to be.
John,
Let me ask you something, Stefan. Can I ask you?
I just want to say, John nearly appointed a different pope. Do you realise what happened? Extraordinary. No, power of the media.
There's only 120 candidates. There can't be 2 Jorge Marios.
Okay, I think it's interesting what you say about the army, and my experience is exactly as you say, in the top ranks, and they pretty much weed out the dross of young officers who have just been through public school and are no use, and the few who get to the very top really are remarkable. What about civil service? Now, after all, we never interview them in public, or not until they've gone. There's always been a strong sense that the civil service is in perpetual decline. Ever since I began, people say, oh, well, they're not the calibre they used to be. Were they ever the calibre they used to be? What kind of leadership behind the scenes are they offering? How do you feel about that?
Well, I think you probably know at least as much about this as I do. It is said that when Gus O'Donnell was still there was some positive feeling about chances for women, in particular at the top of the civil service, and in quite an exodus, on a more biblical language, of women from the top ranks of the civil service in recent times. And I think there's quite a mess going on, frankly. We experimented with this, splitting the roles of Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service. We've got a new Chief Executive from business who is still sitting on the board of a public company until very recently, and having money in a blind trust. Very, very messy indeed. Why wasn't Andy Coulson vetted at number 10? I mean, some pretty horrible things have gone wrong right at the heart of the top of the civil service, I'm afraid to say. So it is worrying.
Are they hubristic?
Well, I don't know much about them, to be honest, because I certainly don't very often get to see them. But I did go and do a pro bono job for the Department of Energy. I chaired a big event, And I was really deeply impressed by the permanent secretary, who, needless to say, had come out of business to do the job. And I also was impressed with that, because he'd taken a salary cut. But he probably made a mountain before he got there.
But not needless to say, you see, there are civil servants of great calibre who are born and bred civil servants. Again, as with a politician, it is an honourable career. It is something you want good people to go into, and some do and stick at it. The assumption that you'll always get somebody better if they come from business because business know how to run things. Business know how to run, on the whole, quite simple things, where all you've got to think about is the bottom line. Either to run a department as a politician or as a civil servant, you have multiple conflicting goals. Balls that all have to be kept in the air at once, and there isn't a single bottom line by which you're going to be judged.
But at least as classicists, they will know what hubris is.
Which is a perfect ending for the panel session. Even in the era of 24-hour rolling news, there are deadlines. So I think our journalists have to head off. So I'd like to thank them on your behalf.
Thank you.